Every client I work with asks me why I started out in Austin, almost 30 years ago. And the reason is I was unhappy with the way search is done as a general statement. The stick rate at the 2-year mark globally way back then was terrible. I mean, it's like 55%, almost one in every two executive hires go bad within 2 years, usually within 18 months. And so I was unhappy with the current model or with the model as it existed back then. And so that's the reason I started the firm. And so when I started the firm in August of 1996, it was with an objective of being the best retained search firm on the planet. Now, I wouldn't present any of the things we do to you as the last word on wisdom, but it's a disciplined, rigorous, battle tested process that's proven to be much more effective than the norm. Our stick rate at the 2-year mark is north of 92%. The global average is about 55%. And so people ask, well, why do you do a needs analysis the way you do it? Why do you write a spec the way you do it? So those are all very good questions, because if you come to us having worked with another search firm, you're probably going to be surprised, because it's going to look different, it's going to feel different. You're going to wind up doing a little more work for us on the front end, but you're going to get it back on the back end. So let's do a needs analysis the way we do it. When we engage in any assignment, whether it's retained search or leadership advisory engagement or whatever, the first thing we do is a very careful deep dive needs analysis. And that includes typically multiple stakeholders. So let's say an average CEO search. On average, most firms will spend, 45 minutes to a couple of hours with one or two people, usually one, and do what they call an intake. That's an intake interview. And we have found those to be woefully inadequate. So I have a number of clients who speak as references for us, and they'll typically say something like, just understand that the quality of the assignment, the quality of the search is dependent on the quality of the needs analysis, and you have a part of that. You clients a part of that. That is a collaborative effort on the part of both or consultants for the search team and the client. So we'll typically engage multiple stakeholders because that's what's necessary to get a clear view of what we're trying to discover during the needs analysis. I'll give you one example. So we did a CEO search for a Salt Lake City company named Maverick Markets a number of years ago. And in the needs analysis, we engaged 22 different stakeholders. Now, mind you, that we don't do that in every case, but this was a very complex search in which we were replacing a CEO, or a COO rather, who had been there 36 years. So replacing somebody that had been there that long is very, very difficult. Plus, this was a very complex organization in that it was, the primary clients were the owners, who were the CEO and COO of a holding company who owned the convenience store company, which at the time was about a $3.5 billion business. And so there was the holding company, there were the owners, there were the existing management, and there was the board. So there were 9 members of the board. And so we engaged with both owners. We interviewed both owners. We interviewed all 9 members of the board. We interviewed all 7 of the direct reports of the people who would report to this new position. We interviewed the incumbent, and we interviewed a number of other senior officers who would have interaction with the new, started out to be a COO search, wound up being a CEO search. And so we do those things because one person is simply not capable of giving us a broad enough view of what we're going after. Does that make sense? So the needs analysis is critically important. From the needs analysis, the output of the needs analysis are 2 things. One is a very well-written spec, and the second thing is a search strategy. And the search strategy and the spec are, once again, collaborative efforts between our consulting group and the client. The spec is very, very important because the spec answers a number of questions. So we believe that a spec should be written with a formula, and that the very first section in the spec should be the opportunity. And that the opportunity section answers the so what question. And the so what question is, why would an A player who's head down and happy, doing a great job for your closest competitor or biggest competitor, want to stop what they're doing, talk to me, and ultimately come to work for you? That's the big question. And if you think about this, unless we can answer that question, you are absolutely destined to wind up with the best of the unemployed, underemployed, and disgruntled. So let that sink in just for a few minutes. The way most firms do a search, most firms' sourcing strategy, by and large, has to do with going to their existing network and people who are coming to them, letting them know that they're disgruntled for some reason and they're ready to make a move. So if that's your position, if that's what you're doing, or if you're posting for the position, I mean, there are all these methods of attracting candidates, but if that's the way you're doing it, you are absolutely destined to wind up with the best of the unemployed, underemployed, and disgruntled. We take the approach, very different approach, and that is we want to cast the widest possible net. We want to go to people who are not looking. So when we start a search engagement, in the process of doing the needs analysis, we'll go back to the spec in a minute, but we're also designing the search strategy. We're working with the client to develop a strategy where we're asking questions like, where should we be going? How wide should the net be? Typically, we'll start in the local geography and spread from there. Most of these are national searches. Some of them are confidential, most are not, but some are. And so our sourcing strategy is geared to bring you the best possible talent and not just a slate. So if we're just going to our network, if we're just, we walked into a shootout a few years ago in which we wound up getting the assignment. We were up against three of the national brands, and the private equity sponsor who wound up hiring us said, well, your competitor just left here. And it was kind of a challenging question. He said, your competitor just left here and threw 10 resumes or 10 profiles on the table and said, your next CEO is in that pile. How do you respond to that? And so I said, you can't, this is fantastic. I said, that in my view is an example of why the stick rate globally is as bad as it is. I mean, that's just crazy. We're there to listen carefully, to build a story. So to go back to the spec a little bit, the first section of the spec is the opportunity section. Describes, why an A player who's head down unhappy would want to come to work for you. Our objective is to reach out to as many people as possible and to offer them and to ask for referrals. So we always like to start by asking for referrals, because if we start out by going after the candidate directly, then that puts us in a position of answering questions rather than asking them. And that's a very important distinction. What we're trying to do is remain in the role of facilitator and not in the role of salesman. The minute we start to sell a candidate on making a move, we lose a certain amount of control of the process. And make no mistake about it, we want to control the process. So if somebody says, well, you're asking me for a referral, why aren't you asking me directly? Or just a minute, let me close my door. Or can you call me at home tonight? Or any one of those things that candidates say if they're interested in the position, then we can say, okay, well, that's great. Glad you're interested. Why is that? And it is at that moment that we begin to take notes and begin our facilitation, really trying to facilitate a match that's going to work and last. And so it is a radically different approach to, assembling, a list of people we already know or people who are in our database and saying, hey, I've got this opportunity, or you're interested. And it becomes kind of like a real estate match or a contingent search match. And I think that's one of the reasons that the stick rate's as low as it is. So to go back to the spec, we've got the opportunity section, which tells a story about, why the opportunity is special. Then we have a very well-written section on culture. That's very, very important. Not only the culture as it exists today, but the culture to which our client aspires over time. That's really important. And then we have a section on the company itself, the most salient things that are going on at the company at the time. And then we drill down on performance expectations. Now, I got to throw in a little anecdote here. One of my favorite authors along these lines is a guy named Ram Charan. Ram is probably the best known authority on CEO selection globally. And he says that there are four things that successful boards do in selecting new CEOs that unsuccessful boards don't. And the reason I'm telling you this story is that, in my opinion, there's an elegant simplicity about what Ram Charan talks about that can be applied to every position in your shop. So he says, number one, successful boards get clear on culture fit. If it takes a month, if it takes 2 months, they take whatever time is necessary to get clear about the culture fit, not only now, but, aspirationally. Number two, they get clear about what he calls the pivot. Remember the fourth section in the spec are performance expectations. We call them performance expectations. Sharon calls it the pivot. And in his words, these are the 3 or 4 things that this new executive is expected to do. How's the P&L going to look different? How do you define success? So these are very specific performance expectations. Ideally, they're no more than 5, usually 3 or 4, but those are the most important things the new CEO, CFO, CIO, whatever is expected to do. So now we've got culture fit, which is section number 2 in our spec. We have performance expectations, which is typically section number 4. And those are the 2 most important things. And so according to Ram Charan, the third thing that successful boards do in selecting new CEOs is that they allow for imperfections. And the fourth thing they do is they're flexible about where they come from. So if you boil all that down, it really says that culture fit and performance expectations are the 2 most important things. And if you get those 2 right, then you can forget about, these 75 things that you think you need that you really don't. As I read specs from all over the world and from many different firms, I find often that they're full of, they're often a woefully inadequate long list of attributes, all based on background, experience, and credentials, without any real focus on culture fit and performance. And those are the 2 things that make the biggest difference. Over 32 years, I've studied about 5,100 failed executive placements, and asked both candidate and client, what happened. And by the way, these are 5,100 executive hires, many of which were, internal promotions. Some involved search firms, some did not. But almost half of the failures that I've studied over 32 years fall into the category of cultural misalignment. Almost the other half, fall into the category of performance expectations. Couldn't do the job or wouldn't do the job. So now we're, when we write a spec, we do a needs analysis, we're asking a number of questions to triangulate and get clear about these things. But at the end of the day, we really want to be crystal clear, and that requires, multiple stakeholder engagement. We want to be crystal clear about culture fit and performance. So assuming that all that's been done correctly, and it takes a little bit of time, full disclosure, we tell all of our potential clients this: you're going to work a little harder with us on the front end than you will with probably anybody else, but you'll get that time back on the back end, and you will stack the deck in your favor. You'll dramatically increase your chances of a great outcome. Once the spec is written and has been approved, and the search strategy has been agreed to by our client, then we do sourcing, which means, reaching out to as many people as we possibly can. We typically map the space. So not just relying on who we know, who's in our database, and we have a database we've been building for almost 30 years. So there's a bunch of folks in there, but that's not the right way to do a search in our view. We map the space, which means doing an analysis of the players in the area who have done the job. So they could step from this job right into our client's job, and they're local. And so, they've got local flavor, fit into the local culture. Many times we have to go broader than that. And in most cases, we're doing national searches, but we're doing the sourcing strategically so that we're starting, in the center and moving out and trying as best we can to reach out to people who we believe would fit in the culture, because cultures are radically different, city to city. Even the difference between the culture in Houston and Austin, 150 miles away, is pretty dramatic. So we start the sourcing. We're reaching out to people and asking for referrals. We typically do a little teaser, and we start that process. If somebody says they're interested, then we start the process of really evaluating whether or not this is a good deal, a good fit for the candidate and the client. these things, in order for them to work and last, it has to be a win-win. It has to fit together like a glove, and it can't be forced. And that's the reason we like to start by asking for referrals. When a candidate says, hey, this could be me, I could be interested in this, then we say, great, let me send you the spec. Let's talk about why you think this is a good fit for you. And it's, as I said before, it's at that point we begin to take notes about why this is or is not a good fit. If that part of the conversation goes well, then we advise the candidate what they will have to do to successfully navigate our process. Number one, they're going to have to complete a self-assessment. That will probably take them 8 to 10 hours. Number two, they're going to have to submit to references, to subordinates, to superiors, to peer, and we do full 360-degree reference audits on all finalist candidates, not just the candidate. Okay, so that's a huge difference. Now, this is critically important for a couple of reasons. Number one, we know from very solid, decades of research, not just by us, but by, people like Brad Smart, who wrote the book Top Grading, that A players, people who are top performers, have built relationships, have built solid track records, and are happy, are eager to provide references. It's kind of funny. I was talking to a board candidate yesterday about a particular board search we're doing, and I told him that I was going to need, we'd had several really good conversations. He completed our self-assessment. I told him we were going to need references, and before I got off the phone, he had references to me. I mean, literally before I got off the phone. I mean, so A players typically are like that. I mean, they built great relationships, they have great networks, and so they're happy to provide references. Here's the other side of that. B minus and C players want no part of this. They want absolutely no part of any scrutiny, any referencing, and they certainly don't want to submit to multiple reference audits, before there's an interview. They just don't want that. So those people, the B minus and C players, will typically opt out very early in the process. Okay. So very, very important stuff. Not only the due diligence, but what happens with an A player when you mention these things, and what happens with a B minus or C player when you mention them. The responses are very, very different. Okay. So let's talk about the 4 C's a little bit. So the self-assessment we use, we call it the 4 C's. It stands for culture, commitment, character, and contribution. Those are the 4 things that we're trying to measure. And the 4 C's, we have a template that we start with for a CEO or a CFO or a board member or whatever, but we tweak that with the information we get from the needs analysis, which flows into the spec, which flows into the 4 C's. So the candidate who is interested in the position, has read the spec, has gotten, some pertinent information, is required to complete this self-assessment. And in doing that, he or she will always change. They'll always either become more or less interested in the position because they'll more fully understand it. They'll be able to see themselves there because they'll be answering questions that pertain to that specific assignment. And in many cases, we'll have, really good candidates self-select out early in the process. We'll have people say, this was really interesting. I read the spec and it sounded really good. But in answering these questions, it's become clear to me, I just don't want to do this job. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for people to self-select in or out as they go through this process. So a search needs to take a certain amount of time. It doesn't need to take a very long time, but it needs to take enough time for candidates to really work through the process and discover, to really do a self-discovery and to decide, with clear eyes and a cool head that this is a good situation for them. Now, there's another reason that we do the 4 C's, and that is that interaction with the client, with the candidate, gives us a very clear understanding of the candidate's thinking style, their writing style, their ability to articulate. And we don't doctor these documents before we send them to the client. So if they come to us with typos and bad grammar and poor syntax, that's the way it goes to the client. And we tell the candidates that. It also gives us a very clear sense for their for their ability and willingness to make and keep promises. This much I can promise you: if they won't perform for us, they won't perform for the client. I mean, they just won't. So it's a testing process for us. And so really, really, really important. And then if all that goes well and we move to the reference audit stage, then that's another key point at which we either move forward full steam, or in some cases we have red flags or yellow flags that pop up that need to be discussed. So we typically do 2 subordinates, 2 peers, and 2 superiors. And there are cases where we have to get a little creative. I mean, we're doing references on a board candidate who's basically, been a CEO for 27 years. So other than board members, he really hasn't had very many superiors. But we've got a good solid representative group of references, and we spend on average with each reference 25 to 30 minutes. So this is not a box checking exercise. This is not, the typical reference will tell you, yeah, we'll verify dates of employment and tell you whether somebody is eligible for rehire. That's not what we're looking for. And I hear people from time to time say that you can't get good references anymore, that people are afraid to talk to, somebody like me for litigious reasons and so forth and so on. I have found that not to be the case at all. I've found most, 90+% of references happy to talk to us and happy to provide really accurate and honest and candid feedback as long as the meeting is set up properly. And so we tell references that we're going to need 30 minutes of your time. We're going to ask you 8 open-ended questions about your interaction with your former boss, peer, or subordinate. And then we're going to ask you to rate the candidate on a scale of 1 to 5 on 50 or so different attributes that come from, our standard template and the adjustments we've made based on what's important to the client. So that information comes from the needs analysis and the spec. So you see how this whole process looks kind of like an engineering process. And so when we get to the references, those are usually very, very telling. And we send a report that shows the reference report that shows exactly, including names, the names of the people we spoke with, their relationship to the candidate at the time, how long they worked together, and then they see attribute grid, which I'll get back to in a minute, and then they see verbatim answers to our questions, those 8 really important open-ended questions. Now, in order to protect the anonymity of the people who are giving us the references, and we guarantee them anonymity, we don't tie any one answer to any one individual. So you see the individuals, you see their names, you see their relationships, but when you get down to the data, you can't tell where the data came from. There are cases in which we have to alter the verbiage slightly, because if it's specific enough, then sometimes it can be tied to an individual. The attribute grid is also critically important. So we have 50 or so different attributes, sometimes as high as 70, and sometimes as few as 35 or 40, but usually, in the 50 range. And what's really interesting about those reports is you see patterns. Look, we all have blind spots. We have strengths, weaknesses, blind spots, all of us. We're all human. And so it's really interesting and valuable for a client to be able to look at the reference audit report and see patterns. We did one recently for, it was a CEO search, and in looking at the attribute grid, it was clear that this individual, very, very accomplished, had been the CEO for one particular company for 23 years, I believe it was. So a long time, very successful. But he had certain tendencies that were borne out by references that you could identify. And knowing what a candidate's strengths and weaknesses are, what their tendencies are, very, very important and very useful as you're onboarding them and coaching with them and developing a relationship with them. So the reference audit piece is huge. And so when we get through with all of that process, and many times we will assess, we've just developed a brand new psychometric assessment to measure leadership potential and leadership attributes. Many times we'll include that. We'll include, in some cases, an assessment of the entire leadership team. That comes with the That's a complementary aspect of our pricing. And so they get all this package. And if a client will read the package, they will know the candidate so well by the time they get to the interview phase that the interview becomes is really kind of a get to know you and a chemistry contest, and really just how well you think they'd fit into the organization based on everything else you've read. So when you compare, the deliverable you get from Alan Austin and the candidate package, it is radically different. It is radically different than what you're going to see in most places. And the reason for that, I keep going back to the why. The reason is the typical search process just doesn't work very well. I have lots of philosophical conversations with clients that I've known for long, worked with for, in some cases, over a decade. And we kind of chuckle about this, that the way the hiring process usually works is just not very effective. And is it really any wonder that it's not? I mean, nobody teaches us how to do this stuff in school. I mean, how many courses? I mean, I'm in the middle of a doctoral program at UT Austin. And so I've had, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of higher education, not one class on how to hire, not one class on how to assess, candidates, not one class on how to do a needs analysis, none of that. So most of us are self-taught, and unless we've been fortunate enough to be in a real data-driven, research-driven environment where we're really trying to get to the root cause of why the turnover rate is so high, we probably don't have those tools. So there's a lot more we could talk about, but that's the essence of the Foresight process.